The Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, deals with emergencies, deals with natural disasters, and one of those types of natural disasters is flooding, of course. So FEMA administers a program called the National Flood Insurance Program. And the National Flood Insurance Program provides flood insurance for people that are adversely affected by floods, and it protects people and insures their homes, so when people are flooded out or a terrible storm takes out people's houses, they can recover. The problem is a component of this program provides for subsidized flood insurance, so cheaper than would be on the market. What that effectively does, however, in many circumstances, is the availability of below market flood insurance means that people can afford to develop areas where they probably shouldn't develop.
Right.
And many of those areas are along streams and in riparian areas. Now that is crucial habitat for a lot of wildlife, and especially salmon. Here, salmon and steelhead here in Oregon. And so many salmon and steelhead throughout the state are listed as threatened or endangered under the Federal Endangered Species Act. So that triggers a responsibility by FEMA to consult with the National Marine Fisheries Service under Section 7 of the Endangered Species Act to allow NIMS to provide FEMA with input as to whether FEMA's administration of the flood insurance program jeopardizes the continued existence of listed salmon and steelhead or destroys or adversely modifies critical habitat for those fish. FEMA refused to go through that Endangered Species Act process. So on behalf of the Portland Audubon Society, the Association of Northwest Steelheaders, and a couple of other organizations, Earthrise brought a lawsuit against FEMA for failing to consult with the National Marine Fisheries Service. After going through a series of negotiations with the federal government, FEMA agreed to settle the case with us and to engage in consultation with the National Marine Fisheries Service. After that, we had to really push FEMA to actually follow through and go through the consultation process. Then the National Marine Fisheries Service had the responsibility of releasing a document called the Biological Opinion, which evaluated whether or not FEMA's proposed administration of this program would violate the Endangered Species Act, or whether FEMA should make changes to its administration of the program to avoid violating the Endangered Species Act. That became very political. And that is because Oregon is one of the first states in which FEMA is actually going through the Endangered Species Act process to evaluate its administration of the flood insurance program. Now, developers in particular, but landowners, love subsidized insurance.
Right.
Because that basically facilitates development. And developers like it, but it's obviously terrible for the environment. But that resulted in a lot of political pushback. So both at the state level as well as at the federal level, FEMA and especially the National Marine Fisheries Service got a lot of political pressure. And there were several times when the National Marine Fisheries Service had to pull back its document, its biological opinion, because of political implications. And we continued to work with a number of other environmental organizations, including our clients, to try to keep pressure on the National Marine Fisheries Service to actually release a biological opinion and make it one that would be protective of salmon and steelhead and their habitat. Finally, in April, the National Marine Fisheries Service released a biological opinion. That biological opinion concluded that FEMA's administration of the National Flood Insurance Program violated the Endangered Species Act. Was likely to jeopardize listed salmon and steelhead, was likely to destroy or adversely modify their critical habitat. And in its biological opinion, NIMS set out what's called a reasonable and prudent alternative, which is kind of a plan for how FEMA could implement the flood insurance program in a way that doesn't violate the Endangered Species Act. And that requires FEMA to really reform the way it administers that program. It requires FEMA to revise its flood maps based on more updated information, including information that takes into account climate change. It requires local communities to revise their zoning ordinances to better protect riparian areas. And that will help keep development away from streams and delicate riparian ecosystems, and therefore better protect fish and their habitat. And so FEMA is going to have to go through a series of steps, including issuing new guidance documents, sort of changing the way FEMA maps floodways and floodplains. And so that's really going to change the way things happen with development or throughout the state. And this sets a national precedent for how FEMA will have to comply with the Endangered Species Act throughout the United States. So it's a really big deal. FEMA itself is still kind of dragging its feet, both locally and I think at the national level. And so our clients and our allies are going to have to continue to put a lot of pressure on FEMA, are going to have to continue to be involved in the process of implementing these changes. So our work is not done yet. We still have a lot of work to do to make sure that these changes actually get implemented on the ground. But if we do, I think we will see some real progress on better protecting riparian areas, not only in Oregon, but throughout the country.
Are there other states then in the country that are in this same process of litigation to try and force FEMA to act?
There are some other cases pending in other states. And FEMA is in the process of doing an environmental impact statement and sort of contemplating how it will have to change its administration of the National Flood Insurance Program throughout the United States. Now this is really an economic as well as an environmental issue.
Right, exactly.
Because actually FEMA right now is about $20 billion, and that's billion with a B, $20 billion in the red with its National Flood Insurance Program. Because particularly with climate change, you see stronger hurricanes, more floods. So Hurricane Sandy, for example, caused billions of dollars worth of damage, and FEMA and federal taxpayers are on the hook to pay for much of that.
And what you're doing, you're not trying to limit those victims. You're trying to say, you're trying to say more so when you're developing and when you're planning on maybe building something, don't build it in the floodplain. Like let's think of all other alternatives. So it's not going to be limiting to those communities. It's going to be more of a preemptive kind of strike, I guess you could say, so that to discourage people from developing in floodplains in the first place.
That's right. We don't want to deprive any victims of storms or floods of any compensation and allow them to recover and allow them to build, but it doesn't really make sense for people to rebuild in an area that was just flooded or that a storm just obliterated. It makes a lot more sense, because then the taxpayers are just going to have to pay once again for people to rebuild. I mean, there have been reports and news media stories about people who have rebuilt 2 or 3 times in the same area only to be flooded out again. And it doesn't make sense for the federal taxpayers to continue to pay to rebuild areas that are just going to be flooded or adversely affected by storms once again. So we would like to see people rebuild, but we want to discourage rebuilding or development in the first place in areas that are vulnerable to storms or flood. And those areas are some of the most important wildlife habitat as well. So the federal taxpayers win, but the environment endangered species win when we don't build in these important riparian areas.
And so is FEMA then also going to be maybe helping local communities to understand where the floodplains are, what the significance is for not only endangered salmon and other endangered species, but also maybe just trying to help them, I guess, figure out ways to develop, but not to develop in these areas where there could be catastrophe? Or
Yeah, exactly right. So in the process of mapping, FEMA maps floodways and areas where also streams meander. And so streams are not, rivers and streams are not fixed in one place. There's a meander zone where they can change their course. And both the floodways themselves and the zones where streams may change their course are vulnerable to damage. And so by doing better mapping and by considering climate change and by considering how climate change may affect where streams go, that will really tell communities where there are vulnerabilities. And then FEMA will also assist communities in saying, here's how you can change your local land use ordinances to keep development away from these vulnerable areas and the areas that are important for wildlife habitat.
And how easily do you think this is going to be for FEMA to make this, I guess, make this change and really start bringing this out and talking to developers? Is this a long-term project that we're looking at, or what's the timeline here?
It's a long-term process. So even here in Oregon, now that there is a biological opinion which sort of shows FEMA the way to go to make these changes, we're looking at probably the better part of a decade to really make all of these changes just in Oregon.
Okay.
And so rolling that kind of reform out across the country will take many years, and it will take a lot of people working hard to make sure that we better protect both our people and our wildlife.
Right.
But yet, you know, it's something very important, something we really need to do, but politically it does have costs because local governments do not like to say no to property owners and developers. Developers like to build in riparian areas because they're pretty and people like to live with a nice view of a stream or something like that. And so that property can be valuable for development, but it just doesn't make sense to develop there.
Right, exactly. Well, thank you very much for informing us, and thank you for watching.